Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're still waiting for a few more people to sign on, but I think it is 6:35, so I'll get started with our introductions. So welcome. My name is Ramona Adlaka, and I am an executive member of BEAT and co-editor of the book Women Rebuild: Stories, Polemics, Futures. BEAT is incredibly pleased to host this event, and I am joined today by our new incoming director, Stephanie Hossein, and core executive member, Fotini Pitoglu. We are really excited to be hosting you tonight, and we are so encouraged by the interest in this event. Thank you to all of you for joining. Please note we are recording the presentation today, and there will be an audience Q&A at the end. So if any questions come to mind during the presentation or discussion portion, please feel free to drop it into the Q&A tab located on your Zoom navigation panel. For those of you who are newcomers or not entirely familiar with our organization, BEAT is short for Building Equality in Architecture Toronto. It is a volunteer-run organization that promotes equality in the profession through advocacy, mentorship, and networking. As the T in our name indicates, we are the Toronto chapter of a larger national group across Canada known as BIA. BIA particularly aims to advance the achievements and visibility of women, minorities, and other underrepresented groups across the country. Beyond providing resources for individual architects, our organization seeks to build momentum for a shift in the profession through its greater diversity and equity on a systemic level. As such, I am incredibly pleased to present this collaboration between BEAT and a few of the women that made the publication Women Rebuild possible. Today, we are joined by three incredible women who are making strides in the industry and who we were lucky enough to have contributed to this publication. My co-editor, Franca, will introduce them momentarily, but I wanted to take a minute to introduce my co-editors. Franca Tribbiano. Franca is an associate professor in architecture at the Weitzman School of Design of the University of Pennsylvania and a registered architect with l'Ordre des Architectes du Québec. She completed her PhD in architecture at the University of Pennsylvania in 2005. Her work has been funded by the Mellon Humanities Urbanism and Design Initiative at Penn, the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, the Perry World House at Penn, and the U.S. Department of Energy. Her current manuscripts include Building Theories, Architecture is the Art of Building, and the co-edited book Biomatter Technosynthetics. Franca is an accomplished author and also from personal experience, a wonderful professor, friend, mentor, and co-editor. That brings me to Rumune Bartusketa. Rumune is a practicing architect at JKRP Architects in Philadelphia. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture with a marketing minor from Miami University, a Master's of Architecture from the University of Pennsylvania, and a certificate in Healthier Materials and Sustainable Building from Parsons School of Design. Rumune serves as co-chair of the Philadelphia Urban Land Institute Women's Leadership Initiative, a board member of a national nonprofit called Rise First, serving first-generation and low-income students, and founder and CEO of Spec Matters, an online resource for writing healthier specifications to make better material selections. As classmates and close friends during our time at UPenn, I can say with some authority that Rumune is an incredibly accomplished, hardworking, and diligent co-editor. With that, I would like to share a little bit about how our book came to be. Our story begins in the fall of 2016 in the United States, Philadelphia to be precise. At that time, as Master of Architecture graduate students at the University of Pennsylvania, alongside with our classmates and colleagues, Rumune and I co-founded a student group known as Penn Women in Architecture. We were lucky enough to also get Franca Tribbiano as our faculty advisor. Altogether, this group gave rise to this publication, which brings us here today. My co-editor Rumune will now share a little bit more about how that came to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramona. Thank you for the introductions. So while gender disparity was not evident among our peers at school, those of us who had work experience felt the need to develop and create a support network which we could carry with us into the workplace. It was not lost on us that while 50-50 distribution of men and women exists in architecture school, only 32% go into practice and only 7% hold leadership positions. We were concerned about these metrics and took action. as the educational environment could not necessarily prepare us for the potential challenges that we would face upon graduation, we felt a need to mobilize a community of designers and thinkers alike with the purpose of increasing the incidence and visibility of women in architecture. Our hope was to bring awareness to the gender disparity that exists in the profession and empower each other by fostering growth, promoting the success of women architects, and above all, cultivating the next generation of leaders in our industry. While at Penn, our student group raised over $40,000 to further the group's mission, organized countless firm crawls across the U.S. Northeast to better gauge various working environments and expand our professional networks. We also organized 2 widely attended international symposiums and launched a continuously expanding mentorship program. These are some images from the symposiums. We joined local professional organizations to better understand the needs of the young female architecture workforce and built long-lasting professional relationships, which we have carried forth into our careers. Women Rebuild was born out of these events and the incredible women we met along the way, including this group of panelists tonight. We are incredibly impressed by the strides our female role models, professors, architects, activists, and builders have made, pushing the boundaries of gender inequality and addressing the important issues which will define our careers. I would now like to introduce our friend, mentor, and co-editor, Franca Trubiano. It has been an incredible privilege to work with you, and she will now share a little bit about the book.
Thank you so much, Ramune and Ramona, and thank you so much to Beat Toronto. This is a great opportunity for us to not only share some of the work that the group has been engaged in, but also to actually, and maybe more importantly, to have a new conversation about where we are today. I'll just say a little bit about the book's content. We were fortunate to have not only articles that helped us think through the history of this question through our framing stories, some of the activism questions that we had at the core of our work, which was located in our section called Shaping Polemics, but incredibly innovative built work that we collected in our section called Building Futures. We also were privileged to have 4 tremendous conversations intersperse the book. Next, please. I'll just show you a little bit of, this is our first section called Framing Stories, where we looked at the longer trajectory of women asking questions about the role of women in the practice. Next, please. And in just one example, I show you the work of Isla Berman, who is familiar to the Toronto community in her provocative piece that asked, is equality sufficient? Of course, the answer for Isla was no. Next, please. In our section on polemics, we have, and I guess we can move forward, we can have a view of the work that our panelist, Annalisa, next please, helped share with regards to data. We can talk about the stories that have impacted the role of women in the design professions, but we can also collect data. And this is what Annalise Pitts helped us see, because numbers do tell stories that are important to decipher and to interpret. Next, please. And then in the context of practice, we looked at a number of important contributions. We had significant contributions from both Shirley and Nicole, and here we just show you, next please, one of the articles that featured Nicole's work, not only in the context of her work in New York professionally, but also in the context of creating community. Next, please. So and yes, not to mention the conversations, we had a tremendous representation of women talking about their work, speaking about their work. And here we had a conversation between Sadie Morgan, who we'll hear a little bit more from tonight, and Samantha Hardingham. And this conversation was had at the AA in Toronto, in London. It would be great to have an AA in Toronto, but the AA in London. So with that, I would just like to maybe, Yes, we'll stay here for a minute. This was a part of an editorial that I had included in the book. And I asked the question, how will we know? And essentially what I was asking there was, how will we know when in fact the conditions for women, and I'm going to say women and others, participating in the profession and in the discipline actually have substantially changed enough to actually create improvements, or I'd say ameliorations of what we call the value structure that permeates architecture, engineering, and construction. Now, 100 years ago, when the Bauhaus actually welcomed a significant number of women in their first class, held in Weimar, Germany, one could have assumed that there was meaningful change ahead. Did the women of the Bauhaus at that time, having been a significant portion of the class, assume that all of their past struggles for intellectual, professional, and political emancipation were actually now over? The promise of a new era was in fact palpable to anyone who attended and visited the school during those early years. Even the ratio of women to men faculty was far better than in some schools of architecture today. More than 13% of the faculty were women at Weimar, 17% when it relocated to Dessau, and close to 8% when the faculty, when the school was actually closed in Berlin, and we know the conditions for that. Now, this was the heady climate of change in which the work of Annie Albers, Lily Reich, Marianne Brandt, and Lucia Mahaly, and others had come to light. Now, why, therefore, did this optimism of those early years quickly give way to, unfortunately, segregated studios and workshops? Why were the women of the Bauhaus encouraged to choose the designated, quote, women classes and to forego apprenticing alongside their male counterparts? And why had so many talented women been ushered into the arts of weaving, bookbinding, and pottery making? So, notwithstanding that the school had a stated interest in transforming architectural education and in its initial promise to host the development of women, it's interesting that other than Lily Reich, who was undoubtedly considered an interior designer in the eyes of most of her male colleagues, no woman who actually graduated or taught at the Bauhaus was ever really considered a practicing architect. Now, fast forward in the 1980s, when significant cohorts of women, including myself, were accepted in schools of architecture in the US and Canada, one might have assumed then that there had been meaningful change. Or let's fast forward even more, the 21st century, when significant numbers of women are now being represented in leadership roles in schools and in professional practice, we might assume that significant change has finally arrived. And yet, as this evening's conversation asks us to consider, many of us and our colleagues have during the past 18 months experienced significant economic, social, medical, and even political challenges, revealing that the continued presence of stark disparities still exists in who architecture and engineering and construction and design is destined for. So I think we'd like to have a conversation about what we have yet still to do, because in fact, the recent challenges of 20 and 21 make this question, how will we know, all the more pertinent, particularly in this hopefully soon to be post-pandemic world. So to this question, we've asked our contributors, Sadie, Shirley, Nicole, Annalisa, to contribute. They'll be offering us short readings of the original and actually updated articles. And during our panel discussion, we'll hear specific insights as to what are some of the examples and evidence of significant movement in how this profession has addressed subjects as diverse as employee recruitment, diversity in client profiles, the act of mentoring, the role that can be played by professional organizations in helping to encourage policy changes, and even in the creation of safe spaces for fostering more open discussions about our profession. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our contributors. I will start with Sadie, who will be hearing from virtually. Sadie Morgan is a co-founding partner of the Sterling Prize-winning architectural practice DRMM. As a design champion, Sadie chairs the Independent Design Panel for High Speed 2 and is a commissioner for the National Infrastructure Commission in the UK. In the UK, Sadie in 2019 was appointed the UK government's Housing a board member for the UK government's housing accelerator called Homes England. And she actually also recently founded Quality of Life Foundation, which actually aims at raising awareness of well-being through the built environment. In 2013, she became the youngest president of the AA in London. And in 2016, she received an honorary doctorate from London South Bank University and was appointed a professor at the University of Westminster. If not enough, in 2017, Sadie became a mayor's design advocate for the Greater London Authority and was named New Londoner of the Year. I'd now would like to introduce Shirley Bloomberg, who is well familiar to our community in Toronto. Shirley Bloomberg is a founding partner of KPMG Architects and a member of the Order of Canada for her contributions to architecture and community. She has designed many of the firm's noteworthy and award-winning projects. I am proud to say that KPMG has a project on my campus at the University of Pennsylvania, having completed the Perelman Center for Political Science and Economics. That's just a stellar building. In addition to Shirley's academic and cultural projects, she's also focused on social justice projects related to affordable housing. Current projects include the competition-winning Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, an affordable residential community in Toronto, and housing for the Northern Indigenous community of Fort Severn in Ontario. Several years ago, Shirley began a conversation with like-minded colleagues, and that became Beat Toronto. So we are doubly and triply fortunate to have Shirley with us tonight. I'd like to introduce Nicole Dasso from New York. Nicole is an architect, an educator, a mentor, and Nicole has spent 20 years of her career working in New York City on complex projects demanding a high level of team coordination and collaboration. During her stay at SOM, her projects included 7 World Trade Center and 1 World Trade Center. She's also worked on 35 Hudson Yards and on the Monaghan Train Hall. Now, as Vice President of Design and Construction of Vornado Realty Trust, Nicole is involved in several projects, including the Penn Station District projects, which includes adaptive reuse of the Civic Farley Post Office and modernization of the 2 Penn building, which is going to include a new Amtrak entrance. Thank God, that entrance needs help. Nicole is the board president of Professional Women in Construction from New York chapter. And in 2012, Nicole was honored in the 40 Under 40 issue of Crain's New York Business and received an AIA Presidential Citation for contributions at the World Trade Center site. In January 2016, Nicole was also elevated to the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects. And I'd like to introduce Annalisa Pitts from Brooklyn, New York. Annalisa is a passionate designer, a researcher, and an advocate for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the profession. As a research chair for Equity by Design, she led the group's nationally recognized research project, of which some of the data is in the book, exploring equity in architectural practice through surveys on professional career perceptions, experience, and aspirations. Annalisa is also a licensed architect with nearly a decade of experience designing, learning, gathering, and living spaces. Now, she recently joined the Cameron McAllister Group, where she applies both her research expertise and her experience working as an architect to her consulting practice, working collaboratively with clients to build a more just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive profession, one firm at a time. So we have an incredible array of speakers with us tonight. And with that, I'm going to ask Ramune to initiate our next part of our session.
Thank you so much, Franca. I will now ask each of the contributors to share a small piece of their articles and then a little bit of a reflection of where they are today. And we will start with Shirley Bloomberg.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, there we go. Unmuted twice. Thank you very much. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from my essay in this wonderful book. And then I'll read a recent, some excerpt from a recent article. Jane Jacobs was living in Toronto when I arrived, and her influence on our city was transformative. Today, it seems obvious that a functioning society is based on inclusivity and diversity, one where all voices are heard. Jacobs noted that, quote, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody, only because and only when they are created by everybody, end quote. As architecture is produced in the always unfinished and ever-evolving fabric of the city, it's imperative that the voices of women architects participate in the collective conversation and expand the discourse about our built environment. As our existing societal structures undergo stress and rupture, the criteria architects must address are well beyond cultural and artistic. They're wide-ranging and very serious. Then, about 2/3 of the way through, through the pandemic, I started writing an article because things were changing so rapidly in real time. It was quite amazing, as you all know. And my article was published in Architect magazine in last month's issue. So I'll read an excerpt from that. And this, I think, relates to what I'd written earlier, but it's certainly an update. As the New Orleans-based design justice activist, Brian Lee Jr. has written, quote, for nearly every injustice in the world, there's an architecture that has been planned and designed to perpetuate it, end quote. The built environment is not equitable. Injustices and exclusion are embedded in our cities, and architects have been complicit. Who gets access to affordable housing and who does not? Who can occupy public space without fearing for their lives and who cannot? Who can seamlessly work from home and who cannot? Our cities have many scars. Can public space be a place of healing? Can we create trust within communities through how and what we design and build? Imagine if design was driven by generosity, if architecture offered people freedom and choice as to how to inhabit the space in which they live. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley. And next up is Nicole.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Dasso. I'm an architect. In 2017, I was approached by Ramone to participate in a Women in Architecture Symposium at Penn Design, and was specifically asked to discuss my thoughts about the future. At the time of contribution to Women Rebuild, I was a technical director at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill's New York office. In October 2019, I parted ways with SOM after 22 years in pursuit of new challenges. The following is an excerpt from my article titled Beyond the Corporate Ladder. March 2019. The nature of work, the types of spaces in which work happens, and the top-down hierarchical pyramid, which has been the roots of corporate America, is disappearing. Small businesses are vital to the economic growth of cities. In the field of architecture, small businesses can and do have an important voice. Therefore, I pose the following question. As women in architecture, should we continue to focus on how to climb the old hierarchical corporate ladder, a structure originating from a male military service that is inefficient, irrelevant, and out of tune? Or should we be empowering women to design and construction to use their voices and find their own platform? Top-down pyramids provide a singular path and are a shortcoming of hierarchical organizations. Formal hierarchy does not respond to a rapidly changing world and has proven to be gender biased across many disciplines. In contrast, a bottom-up approach provides individuals with multiple paths to grow and empowers a more complex organizational system. Meshwork models are powerful, fluid, and complex. They grow organically and create an array of ways to connect. In the future, I predict large-scale hierarchical business models will likely not become extinct. However, for such business models to remain relevant, compete with evolving technology, the next generation of entrepreneurs, and clients who want to retain design firms that emulate their own think tanks, hierarchical or business models will need to reimagine themselves to stay in the game. Today, we are at an important moment for the future of women in architecture. Metrics should not solely be focusing on women's climb up the corporate ladder. Instead, we should celebrate and encourage the percentage of business owned by women and their successes. October 2021. The pandemic created a paradigm shift in the workplace. The status quo has been challenged. The consequences have yet to be seen. However, we can be sure that the definition of work and how it is conducted has changed forever. A shift towards a decentralized model offers the possibility of eliminating bias and the possibility of eliminating categories such as best dressed, best looking, most popular, most educated, most athletic. With a paradigm shift, we cannot continue to measure success with the same metrics. Breeding indistinguishable individuals bound by titles and molded by antiquated hierarchical platforms. I predict the future will be about bespoke job descriptions and bespoke titles, unique to the value an individual brings to a project or role, and not about how many boxes they check. Comparing and measuring against others or standards established by antiquated metrics and systems suppresses diversity. Circa March 2020, showing up in person was a necessity, a requirement. If the future is about a decentralized model, will in-person remain a valued proposition? Or does this open the possibilities for the parent, the caretaker, every individual to live where you want and the flexibility to not have to choose between a career and personal? Is the dissolution of 9 to 5 so radical? A more fluid workflow has the potential for change by eliminating hierarchy boxes, classifications, and straight edges that stifle creativity and individuality. A more fluid workflow has the possibility to shake the roots of gender and equity issues. We need to stop looking at the old paradigm to measure change. Real change requires a paradigm shift. The pandemic shook the foundation of the old edifice in a seismic way. This type of change and the conversations taking place may have taken decades and possibly never have happened at all. Once the popular and celebrated stories were the climb of the corporate ladder, measuring the standard of success with antiquated and irrelevant metrics. Today holds promise for success to have a different measurement. It is up to each of us to harness this moment and not fall back to the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Annalisa Pitts.
Hi there. Well, thank you for those two readings, Nicole and Shirley. Fantastic to hear from you and to learn more about what's happened since we all got together that day in 2017. My reading came from a piece about research that I had done as the research chair for Equity by Design, and so I'm speaking on behalf of the rest of that committee as well. But Equity by Design began with the idea that all practitioners, regardless of personal identity, deserved the opportunity to have a sustainable and satisfying career in architecture. The challenges that women faced in the profession, the group believed, were symptomatic of a deeper lack of access to the resources and opportunities that each professional and each architectural practice needed in order to thrive. Rather than advocate for women's equal participation in a field that wasn't serving anyone particularly well, therefore, we set out to change the profession to better serve individuals from all walks of life. To build this kind of movement, we needed to understand the broad challenges that the profession faced, as well as the ways that these dynamics were shaped by intersections with issues of personal identity. This conversation required the full participation of a diverse range of voices, including those of all genders, races, ethnicities, and cultural backgrounds. An informed conversation also required new metrics to support the anecdotal evidence that had driven the group to action. This data would be gathered both to demonstrate the scope of the problem at hand and to identify equitable practices that could be implemented to promote sustainable and satisfying careers in architecture for all individuals. So that was 2017. I actually think this was written, we were remembering this in our little session before today. This was actually written the week that the piece about Richard Meyer came out, so right in the thick of the Me Too movement arriving in architecture. Since then, I don't need to say that a lot has changed in the broader sphere, but I think, for me, what has changed is that I became a mom, and all of a sudden these things that I had been studying theoretically all of a sudden became the pragmatic challenges of my personal and professional life. And I think that having that happen against the backdrop of 2020 and 2021 has dramatically changed the way that I think. All of a sudden, I've been faced with the need to, or with the recognition that I couldn't fit the box of a male professional working through the hierarchy anymore. It became an existential crisis where I sort of needed to find my own voice within the profession. And I think that against sort of 2020 shone a light on everything, on inequities and injustices that existed within our societies that have been here for a long time. It forced all of us to pause and think about those things, which I think that Shirley talked about really eloquently. And for me, what it meant was that I couldn't sit on a panel on a Thursday night and talk theoretically about how our field needed to change or point out the problems, then go back to work and design bank lobbies and houses for millionaires and billionaires on a Monday. The issues that face us internally also impact what we do externally. And I think that that's become really, really clear to me and has caused me to take a pause from practice and shift to help practices figure out how to move away from talking about these issues and towards action. And so I'm spending some time doing that now, and it's given me a tremendous amount of hope. I think we have a long way to go. We're not there, but we do recognize that we need to change. Our clients are demanding that we change. Our talent, especially the young talent, is demanding that we change what we do. And I do think that through forums like this, and then through actually taking it back and doing something about it, even if it doesn't change the world, if it makes progress, I want to hear about it. So I think that we're poised for action, and I'm excited about that. But I do think that we have an enormous task ahead of us.
Thank you so much, Annalisa. I will now share a recording from Sadie Morgan. We had sent her some prompts, and this will be a nice segue into our discussion portion of the event.
So the biggest profound difference over the last 6 months to a year, when everybody's been, stuck at home working, is the fact that we've really had to try to recreate that sense of creativity. It's all very well if you're doing emails or writing reports if you're on your own, but that sort of level of creative energy that you get in an office is something that's really difficult to recreate over Teams. So what we've been doing is trying to make sure that we are constantly engaging with each other, not just through work. So we're trying to re-engender that social opportunities, and any moment that we had where we could meet legally, we did. And now as we move back into the office, I think we're really using the office space for that creative work. We're still allowing people to work from home, to do those pieces of work that in fact, sometimes it's nice to have the quietness or have the ability not to have to sort of come into work and such. But for those moments of creativity, reviews, designing, I think it's absolutely important that we get together, and that's something that we've been encouraging back at DRMM. My work at the National Infrastructure Commission and also at Homes England, with 2 government advisory roles, is really trying to focus the debate on people and making sure that when we make big design decisions, we're thinking holistically, not just in a sort of very technical way. I set up a design group and at the National Infrastructure Commission, and we wrote some really serious recommendations that all infrastructure of national significance should be subject to design review, should have a design champion at board level, and we also wrote principles for national infrastructure, and that they revolve around climate, people, place and value. So really trying to ensure that when we design and deliver our infrastructure, we're thinking firstly about our planet, secondly about people and how our infrastructure affects them, thirdly about the place in which that infrastructure lands, and fourthly about value. And if we start, I think, to think about what we design in our big infrastructure investment, our big housing investment, not about cost, not about the time it takes to deliver, but around value and around the social value and the way in which those investments can permeate into society in a much more positive way, then I think then I'll be happy. So at DRMM we have 60% women, we have 21 nationalities, and we've always had a really diverse workforce and team, which I think brings a sort of richness and cultural diversity to the work that we do. But it's difficult, I think, for architects particularly to bring a change unless their clients are also diverse, and unless the people who are giving out the work and who are writing the briefs come with a different and richer perspective. So I suppose if I reflect on the work of DRMM, I'd look at the Hastings Pier. Hastings Pier was a project where the community actually was the client, and we had 1,000 people who actually helped us write the brief. We curated their hopes and dreams into a project, which, you know, it won the Sterling Prize, and it won the Sterling Prize because I think it was a reflection of so many people's aspirations, and it has a real soul to it, and it has a real spirit to it of positivity and endurance. And I think, as I said before, without the richness and diversity of the people who made that project happen, it wouldn't be as special as it is.
All right, thank you, everyone. I think we will now transition into our discussion.
Thank you for sharing the videos, Ramune. That was really wonderful to see and hear Sadie's voice again after so long. So at this time, we do encourage, if you guys have questions, please do feel free to populate the Q&A. We will be leaving some time at the end to go through the Q&A with all our audience members, and we're happy to kind of discuss anything further that you may be interested in. But just to kick off our discussion, I guess one of the things that we've been talking a lot about is the idea of shifting kind of our corporate culture or our mentality as we move forward in a post-pandemic world. So I guess I ask our esteemed panelists here if they had some thoughts on kind of any specific policies or ideas that they're thinking to implement into their workplace to start to create and actually manage the change. Shirley?
Thank you. Yes. I also wanted to, I like Franca's question about how do we know when things have changed in this post-pandemic. You're being optimistic, Franca, post-pandemic world. And where are we seeing substantive change? So I think two things. I think we've seen a huge amount of change already because the pandemic is a wonderful disruptor. And the second thing is I also really believe that the pandemic accentuated and brought focus to change that was already happening and issues that were already in place. So it's, I think there have been really encouraging things happening. I think the blurring between work and home is very, very interesting. For the first time, and I think this is typical of most architectural practices, there's now a complete openness to working from wherever you are. And also, given the high cost of housing in cities, some of our people have moved to smaller cities and so on, or towns. So that's much more flexible. We've developed a hybrid working model in our office where people can come in for a few days a week and they can work at home for a couple of days a week. And we also have flexible working hours. As long as we're all working within a certain time range, you can figure it out. So I think that has been really great for people in our office. The equity, diversity, and inclusivity issues, the injustices and inequities have just been startling through the pandemic. So what we did is we've taken this very, very seriously at KPMB, and we developed a mandate and basically for EDI in our practice, in our profession, and in our work. And I have to say also, our clients have been fantastic because a lot of clients, particularly university clients, are demanding that we do something about it. And we know that architecture is very slow and blah, 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 blah. But if we don't do something now, we never bloody well will. So it's made us much more conscious about what's going on in our office. We've changed our hiring practice. We've assigned a budget to EDI initiatives. And what we've done is, because we realized that if we're going to change it in the profession, you have to look at young people in school. You have to look at the pipeline and do what you can. And so we've been working with the University of Toronto and Ryerson University, who did summer camps for high school students. And we connected them with, through a friend of mine, with the school in Rexdale, which is a very disadvantaged community in Northwest Toronto. And this is a middle, elementary and middle school. And the principal and vice principal were all over this. And what we did was we managed to have about 20 young people, and they did a special session for Elmbank Elementary School, participate in these summer camps. Young people who hadn't heard about architecture and design. And part of the problem is, if you can believe it, they had 3 laptops. Kids need a laptop and Wi-Fi. So we bought 17 laptops. So everyone would have a laptop, and we paid for Wi-Fi and so on. And what's really great is we had young people in our office talk about their experience, and that was a diverse group. And some of those kids then went on to do further camps. They wanted to continue with Ryerson and U of T, and we're very interested in it. So it's a start, but we were thrilled at the response. And I think the only way we're going to change things is to jump in, feet first and change things. And there are a lot of agencies out there, like we've and I think DSA, Ramona, also supports this, Inspire. We've created a scholarship for Indigenous kids for architecture, etc. So we've got an awful lot of work to do, but what we've done is we've involved our whole office in this discussion. And I think it's been really, really important. And I'm excited because we've never spoken about these issues before. So I think it's really great.
I think I'll just jump in and just say a couple of things. I think fairly similar to what Shirley's saying. I think the first thing I noticed is that employees are listening more to their employees. And I think that that's an important shift. I think throughout the sort of pandemic, there was sort of an outreach to employees to understand, how they were doing, and then sort of bringing people back, onboarding them back into into the workplace. It's still happening. Lots of firms reached out to understand surveys as how comfortable people were, how their lives had changed. Instead of, sort of making these kind of erratic decisions after, at a certain point about bringing everybody back, I think people took pause. And I think that that's actually really important, because that was an important moment where things could have gone in one direction or another. And I think that sort of pause and listening to your employees and what your employees are saying was something that is a real shift. Another thing that I would say is that I think some of the changes that have happened have been encouraging for emerging professionals and for students looking to go into the field of architecture. Because I think that, by creating sort of more of a work-life balance, I can certainly remember, in my starting years, working 70 hours a week, working 7 days a week, and, being in the office, and that was the only way that work could be done. And so I think re-looking at that and, making it more, appealing to emerging professionals and, individuals, students, high school students looking to enter into the field. I think that has been a major focus or a major reason for a lot of departure for people, is that the burnout and the sort of inability to kind of have, some sense of work-life balance. And then I think the other thing that I would say, myself included, is just being able to have choices and not having to choose between, my career and personal. And, I think, having been someone who always worked in the office, I think the fact that, I can work from home and all of a sudden starts to sort of change, the way that I work and the way that I think about things. And frankly, becoming actually more efficient in my time. And so I think just having that sense of choice is really important and has been a major shift.
I'm happy to answer this one, but I'm also happy to let you keep going. I know that we've only got, so much time here. Well, okay. I've actually lived through this change on sort of two sides of the aisle. I was, for about 6 months of the pandemic, I was still employed with my old firm. And in that capacity, we sort of were trying to get an EDI initiative off the ground. And I experienced the tremendous frustration of pushing the Sisyphean task of trying to push the boulder up the hill from the inside. And firms aren't all there, and having an EDI initiative does not mean that a firm has solved the problem. And I think that that's just something that we've all learned to recognize. But I think I also learned from that experience that it's incredibly hard to make changes from the inside, because we are a hierarchical profession. And that means that when you ask a young person in your office how they're feeling about something, it may not be safe for them to tell you the truth. And so in a consulting role, it's been really interesting to then go into offices as a third party to conduct surveys where people provide anonymous feedback that truly is anonymous, and then to feed that back to firms and to use that to inform conversations, because I think it brings out just some different types of information. So it's been exciting to see firms invest in that, and then to sort of develop frameworks for solving problems. So we are seeing firms use assessment information to create visions. So what does EDI look like for our firm? What do we see as the future here? What are we working towards? And even to move into adopting strategic action plans about EDI the same way they would adopt like a strategic sustainability action plan, so that they're actually holding themselves accountable to real sort of actionable tactical goals, rather than just sort of a theoretical, we want 50% female partners by 2026, which, there's no teeth to that.
So if I could just add a little contribution from the side of, let's just say, university environments. Interesting to note, Shirley, that you were saying your university clients are actually asking from their professionals that they're dealing with to be as committed to some of the DEI benchmarks that the universities are instituting for themselves. And I can say that I am more than thrilled to, in fact, give evidence of that, that over the past year, I have only seen more and more improvement in this area, but specifically with metrics. And so I see that we have instituted metrics in terms of our student diversity, our faculty diversity, and at all levels of faculty engagement. And we actively are hiring for diversity. In other words, we are encouraging all of our students and our faculty to make proposals, to make suggestions, and we act upon them. So I can't be more thrilled from that perspective. Of course, I can only hope that we keep that up, right? So it's one thing to be doing it year one, year two. The question is, how do we know when in fact it's become part of a cultural change and not just a kind of moment in the larger history? So that's what I'm looking forward to. I'm looking forward to that year 3 and year 4 and year 5, where we can still see those metrics of change. Now that's from the point of view of DEI. But at this point, I'd also like to just give a little bit of a kind of counter narrative to the question of flexibility that many have felt in their professional lives with regards to the virtualization. In fact, what we're doing right now, right? Much of the flexibility that we have in working in different spaces, whether it happens to be, away from cities, away from the office, is because we have access to technology. And because this technology creates a certain amount of connectivity without necessarily physically having to all be in the same space. Now, I do want to say that from 3 perspectives, this has proved to be a little bit more challenging than at first we might notice. I can say categorically that for our students, it has been really difficult. It has been really, really difficult for our students to live in this virtual world for a number of reasons, primarily because they don't get to see each other. They don't understand the kind of socialization of the discipline. They don't really, as Sadie was sharing with us in terms of the kind of creativity that happens when you are with others. This has been a real challenge for our students to be separate from others and not in the kind of physical space of others. Secondly, it's also been a real challenge for our young graduates, or graduates that were from this last cycle and the cycle previous. I have heard from more recent graduates in the past 2 years than I've ever heard from, because of course, as Annalise just noted, a young person who comes into an office is by definition distanced from others and requires those social engagements in order to create that kind of cultural capital that allows them to feel safe and that allows them to understand the kind of larger dynamics that really are difficult to understand virtually. And so I want to say that even our young graduates are having those issues. But while I cannot speak for women in offices because I'm not in an office, I can say that women on our faculty are also struggling with the current situation. They're struggling because when they are at home, because of the nature of the way child rearing is, they are carrying a higher level of the burden and trying to conduct a Zoom event while children are there in the space is difficult for many of our faculty. And we've noticed that, in fact, over the last year, it's been reported that women, in terms of their productivity, their effectivity rate and their productivity rate has decreased in comparison to their male colleagues for whom it has increased. So it's not even that it was a kind of a benchmark condition. It's in fact, one has gone negative and one has gone positive. So I just offer it as a kind of caveat because in as much as the built space has privileges some and penalizes others, so too does the virtual environment.
That's quite a lot of items to unpack there. Really great points. I think, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of a little bit curious. Shirley, you shared a little bit about sort of some of your firm's practices, and now I'm kind of curious to know, if there's, and I think kind of Sadie touched on it a little bit about sort of specific policies that are in work at a larger scale, so kind of government policies, policies within organizations, just sort of shifts and changes that are happening. And I'm just kind of curious to know what all of your thoughts are on that. Have you gauged sort of a difference? And I should kind of note that we're all in different cities. Some of us are in Toronto, some of us are in Philadelphia, some of us are in New York. So I'm curious to know from kind of a policy making level and at the government level, have you kind of noticed any sort of changes or shifts that the pandemic has ushered or is going to usher?
Well, I think, citizens are always way ahead of governments because of all the obvious complications about governments and politicians and so on. So hopefully they'll catch up. But what I think is super encouraging is how large institutions like universities have pivoted so quickly. And compared to your experience, Annalisa, at your firm in the first 6 months of the pandemic, maybe because I'm a founding partner and I said we're going to do this, maybe that helped. But people were very, very receptive. And we've got a long way to go. And what we're, as Franca said, we're not just feeling, oh, great, we've done some stuff here. We're going to try and measure every year our progress. And we're asking our staff to respond to us. We want this to be a dialogue. Now, that's all well and good, but if you hadn't noticed, architecture's a serious boys' club, and it hasn't changed that much. So even though, well, some of males of the species cannot comprehend what the problem is, even the ones that do say, yes, there's a problem and we need to listen and hear everyone's voice, they'll say that, but that's not really happening. That's from my experience digitally, and it'll be interesting to see when we get back into the office, more, hopefully. And the intimidation factor is huge, of course. People are going to tell you what you want to hear because, we're not, we try to be as uncorporate as possible in our culture, but there's no question. There are leaders and then there are people. It's an apprenticeship, right? But another great thing I think that came out of this was a very robust mentoring program in our office. So we've actually, what is also great that came out of this is it's given us pause to rethink everything, quite honestly. So the mentoring program, it's really, really good and people are responding very well. The other thing we've done is because we couldn't meet, every 2 weeks, we've had a town hall throughout the pandemic, and we've had young people, not the leaders of the projects, but the younger people present the projects to the rest of the office, which gives them great experience. And then we've also now started a thing over the year and a half of inviting really interesting people that are friends that can talk to topical issues, et cetera, which has been wonderful in terms of just, exposing the issues, talking about the issues and bringing it to the forum. And I'm hoping that I can see that's encouraged younger people to speak up a bit more too, So we never did that before in the same way we used to, but not every 2 weeks. So I think we actually talk, I find I actually talk more with my partners now than I did before. We're making we have to change. And because the hardest thing about all this is what, is it Sarah in England? Is that her first name?
Sadie.
Sarah? Sadie, sorry, Sadie, pardon me. Referred to, which is, it's really hard to do what we do digitally. Oh my God. It is so cumbersome. Even if you sketch and send a sketch to a junior, they still don't understand the thinking. And so it comes back wrong. And so it takes a huge amount of effort to try and put a design together with the team. But there are other benefits we found, that we've learned a lot of other lessons.
Great, thank you, Shirley. Annalisa, I actually had a question for you. I know you kind of mentioned that you feel hopeful being on the other side of the practice and actually talking to some of the organizations. So I was thinking from what have you heard that has made you feel that way? I know you said there's a lot of work to do, but I was curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that the first thing that I will say, as somebody who, I think I was basically at the point in my career where Ramona and Ramune are now when I participated in this panel. And I think, like a lot of young architects, I stuck with one firm for a really, really long time. And so I only saw one way of doing things, and I assumed falsely that it's the only way that things are done in the field. And I think that that holds us back as a field as a whole, because so many of us assume that what we know is the way that it is. So that, first of all, just seeing a lot of firms who approach similar challenges in a lot of different ways gives me hope, because I think that somewhere someone is going to come up with some really good solutions. And if we can create the platforms to share those good solutions and help them proliferate through the industry, I think that's fantastic. So that gives me hope. I think that not at a firm level, but I've just gotten to meet a lot of people and get to know people better who are thinking about these issues in really great ways. And I think that there's an energy around changing firm culture as a way of actually doing better design that's more relevant to our communities and to society, that's gaining traction. And so I think, you know, when I hear somebody like Brian Lee going into the AIA large firms roundtable and telling large firms, you know what, I'm stacking, like I am helping my friends get into planning departments in cities, and we're writing critical race theory language into RFPs. And if you don't change, I'm coming for you. Seriously, I mean, he said that to some of the most powerful people in the industry, and people are listening to it. And they're taking it seriously. So I'm tremendously hopeful for some of those reasons. It's a lot about the external pressure and the sharing of knowledge at this point.
Can I add to that? From our perspective, our experience is I'm tremendously hopeful because of the young people in our office. Man, they've got their heads screwed on straight and their values, and they're demanding that we look at these issues. And, you know, I think it's wonderful. They have a whole different approach than we had because of the times that we're living in, you know? And also the other thing I'm hopeful about is because we have a KPMG lab, and because of the overwhelming climate crisis, and the changing in all the regulations and technologies, etc., we've been on a concerted effort to re-educate our architects and students. And it's very, very exciting, you know, how everything's kind of cracked open now. And I think it was, sorry, I'm a little jet lagged. Montreal, Leonard Cohen, who had this wonderful song that said, there's a crack in the jar, that's where the light comes in. So it's cracked. So that's why I'm hopeful.
Beautifully said, Shirley. Thank you for that. I can also attest to that. My firm, the efforts in DEI especially, were all led from the bottom up. It was all really designer level, entry level professionals who were really demanding change. And my firm definitely acted on it and created committees, and we're doing many different things to kind of address that. But I know I wanted to ask Nicole, I know you work closely with Syracuse students, and you're also very in tune about what's going on in New York. I would ask you to share a little bit more about that, what you're seeing, and if it's kind of the same trend as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's kind of what I sort of already started to say earlier, but I think you know, everybody was looking for change, and in my sort of talk of where I think I am now, and like where I think things are today, back when I wrote the article, I saw change was happening, but you know, there was definitely, the writing was on the wall that change was happening, and people, you know, we're looking for different modes of practice. I also, like I said, was somewhere for 22 years and saw a very, you know, small spectrum of like what the architecture community, you know, was like. And leaving sort of definitely opened my eyes to, you know, different modes of practice. But I think, you know, it was really, you know, people demanded, you know, and are going to continue to demand. And I think you're right, probably from, you know, more grassroots working up. But I saw that people from all levels, from all levels of leadership also then wanted it. And so I think that's where I'm most hopeful, is that it's coming from all directions. People are looking for change. So it's high, mid, emerging professionals, men, women. So it doesn't have bias, it doesn't have gender. And I think that is has been really interesting. I would say that the other thing that has been interesting to me is collaboration, right? Like architecture is fueled by being a collaborative profession, but I saw different modes of collaboration that I wouldn't have. Like I was forced to reach out to individuals that I might not have ever had the opportunity to work with. Like, for example, was fabricating curtain wall in Canada. And because I physically could not go there, I had to find somebody in Canada who didn't have to cross the border. And so those kinds of things have opened up my mind to how, the individuals that we can work with don't need to be necessarily sitting in my backyard. And because I came from an international firm, a lot of our work was done remotely already and through different modes of technology. I think this pushed us to a whole nother way in which jobs can get done, work can get done. I know in the beginning I was working throughout the pandemic. I worked at Moynihan Train Hall, which was considered an essential project, and so the project actually shut down for only I think 2 days during the entire pandemic. And in the beginning, everybody basically said construction it's in situ, everybody must show up. And I would say that as time moved on, people started to realize that even those in situ jobs could be done, some portions of it could be done more remotely. And that there were aspects of the things that we were doing that could be done remotely. And so that was actually interesting, because in the beginning there seemed to be no shift in that. So yeah, I think ultimately what's coming of this is a more connected industry, more collaboration across the country, across the globe. And I think that that will continue as technology continues to evolve. I think that will continue to increase. So I'm hopeful for that.
Great, thank you, Nicole. Also curious, as we see all these changes, and especially the changes for the better, I'm curious, anyone can jump in and answer this, but like, how do we make sure this is sustainable? How do we make sure that we keep up with this and don't revert to our old ways of doing things? And as life gets busy, as projects become more demanding, how do we not revert back to those 70-hour weeks? Franca, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the question. I also just want to acknowledge that there is a question in the Q&A, so I'll keep my answer really brief. But I think it's really great that we're asking these questions internal to architecture. But I also would like to just, make the point again that architecture is predicated on its relationship to others that are not in the same, let's just say, that are not necessarily in the same horizon of awareness as we might be, or at least as we are speaking about this evening. So it may be that industries that our work depends on, such as the building industry, may or may not be as sensitized to the kinds of things that we're speaking about tonight. And so while I appreciate the caution, how do we sustain this? These set of changes. I also think that I would love to hear from our panelists about best practices for bridging what are maybe less aware conditions, right? Because many of our professionals and our colleagues are working with on sites and in contexts where levels of insensitivity, levels of maybe, let's just say, kind of corporate, but also sort of, capitalist tendencies will maybe make it really difficult to appreciate all the kinds of things that we're talking about tonight. And I just want to say that, architecture is predicated on a tremendous movement of capital. And with that comes certain structures that are financial, that are bureaucratic, and that are building based, that may not have the same level of sensitivity that we may be cultivating amongst ourselves. And I just kind of wondering if there are some best practices for that. And that's a meta question, but there's a more specific question in the Q&A.
That's a great point. And Franca, I'll read out this question that was posed because there's some similarities, and then I'll open it up to our panelists here. But so we have a question, and it's in this very similar vein. They're asking, what advice do you have for young professionals to begin change in their offices? If the leadership in place is resistant to change or advancement, how does one approach them to encourage more equality in, I'm assuming this is project assignment, and also hours flexibility? Shirley.
Well, if you've approached them and they are resistant to change, then vote with your feet. Go somewhere else. It was interesting during the pandemic, there were a few offices in the city that very surprisingly, and I won't name them, shockingly insisted that their staff come in during lockdown, and people left. We hired some of them. And I think also in terms of employee-employer relationships, the whole thing has inverted, right? So employees are now demanding decent working conditions. I think I heard that last week that in the States, 4.5 million people in the restaurant and sorry, I'm still jet lagged coming from France. What's the other industry where loads of people are leaving? At any rate, both very low paying jobs and low wages, et cetera, et cetera. Internationally, people can't find labor in restaurants. Internationally, the entire supply lines of the entire planet have been disrupted. That's going to slow everything down. It already has. So it's not back to business as usual. It's not like, oh, the pandemic's over, assuming it was, and we could just kind of go back the way we were. We'd be really stupid. But I think the circumstances are so draconian. The climate change alone is so draconian. If we want to survive as a species, we have to change. And if any of us are in contact with young people, we will change. And I see it on construction sites. There are many more women involved. It's a different attitude. It's much more partnering. Clients, and also regulation. For certain clients like developers, they're not known to be concerned about sustainable design, but regulations are taking care of that. And in Toronto, it's very aggressive. We'll eventually be almost at passive house level. Vancouver's doing the same. So that's excellent. That's a good example, Ramona, of a very positive policy, decision. So these are shifts in a relatively short span of time. And I think it's never been as exciting as it is now to be an architect. I really do. It's kind of everything's, the cover's been blown off, open. And we actually have the skills because it's our design thinking skills. So we basically, what we do is we take opposing ideas and we reconcile them and make sure they both work. And that's a particular skill set, synergistic skill set that we have as architects. And I think that's really valuable right now. So it sounds pretty good to me.
I do want to offer the curmudgeon's point of view on this, reversing gender roles here, or not reversing generational roles here.
Yeah.
I think it is worth thinking about this very exciting time of growth in the context of what's happened over the last 18 months, and particularly what transpired during the first 6 months of the pandemic. We faced unprecedented layoffs in our industry, and guess what? Women and mothers in particular were disproportionately impacted by that wave of layoffs. We've by no means recovered to where we were prior to the pandemic. I will say this tonight because I think we do need to talk about it. I'm one of the moms that got laid off during the pandemic. And I think it was partially because of how I spoke up. And so I think that if you're in a place where you have an employer who doesn't support you, yeah, vote with your feet if you can, but recognize that voting with your feet is a privilege that's not always available to us in our industry, which is highly dependent on economic cycles. And so use the highs to your advantage because it will propel you through the lows.
And to quickly add to that, I would also suggest to utilize your network, especially in your city, like see what other firms are doing, like what your peers, what are their situations. And if everyone's experiencing the same thing, then maybe you should wait it out until that high comes along. But yeah, I'd strongly suggest to use your networks and the groups that you're involved in to kind of use them for support through those times.
I'll just say one last thing though about this, that from what I'm seeing in New York is that there's enormous opportunities out there today. I mean, everybody that I know across the market sector in architecture, construction, real estate development, there's tremendous momentum for movement. So there are jobs out there. So I actually, I do think it's an optimistic time. There's definitely a lot of people moving around. So I think that that's optimistic. And, I know we said it earlier about, being nimble. I think it's important. I tell a lot of young people this when I talk to them. From my generation, I feel like a bit of a dinosaur that, people graduated from school, they got jobs. I moved back to New York. There were, 5 major companies in New York doing the scale that I was interested in. And that was kind of a path, and people kind of stayed in their jobs for long periods of time. I can remember even when I started doing interviewing and you look at resume and people had a lot of transition, you sort of scratched your head. Towards the end of my tenure at SOM, I was doing all of my own recruiting for my studio. And I never felt that way, looking at resumes. Like I was always interested as to what people were searching for, what they were looking for. And so my advice today is always to young people to be nimble, to learn about, different firms, as it was said earlier about, constantly talking to other individuals to understand what other opportunities might exist, even when you're not looking. That's always the best time to be looking, is when you're employed and you've got a job. But to always kind of be looking at that and looking out to see what other opportunities may exist. Because I think that I know for myself, I looked for, as I was thinking about leaving and starting on a new journey, I looked for almost 4 years just doing research. And I tell a lot of young people that it was actually an important period of my career, because I reached out to individuals that weren't necessarily looking, but just to talk to them, to understand what their roles were like, what their jobs were like. And understand how others in the industry saw me and where they thought that I could bring the most value. And so that was an actually very interesting time period for me. And I think it's actually really, really healthy, even if you're not looking for a particular job, but just to kind of keep talking to people, understanding more about the industry.
That's really amazing insight, Nicole. I was nodding furiously. Thank you for that. So I have one question actually that I would like to pose to all of us. It might be a nice way to kind of cap off the night. We've been talking a lot about change, and sort of the pandemic has been this catalyst for change. And hopefully we're heading in the right direction, and we have some tools and ideas on how to kind of measure the change as it happens. But the one thing that I'm curious to know from each of you, and it will be interesting to hear because I think we all have different priorities, but I'm interested to know for each of you, what do you think is one thing within our profession that needs to change in order for our industry to make equity the norm? Is there kind of one thing that you can pinpoint that would really help get us there?
I think.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing, Ramona, because, and indeed your symposium that the 3 of you on that side of the screen did pointed it out so clearly. We're dealing with millennia, deep-seated cultural biases, you know. I'm certainly not going to see equity in my lifetime, and I would certainly bet all my money that you won't either. But it doesn't mean we can't make progress. And the thing about it is, it's you know, just to give an example, somebody I know was writing there's a woman architect who's writing a letter of recommendation for another woman architect to be a fellow of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. And she said, take a look at my letter, tell me what you think. And the letter was great. And at the end she said, and so also has raised a lovely family. I said, what are you doing? Would you do this for a man? Oh, no. You know, so even a very evolved feminist woman, like we're products of white privilege and all this, you know, everything. It's the way it's ingrained in us, right? So it takes a lot of work and self-awareness and discussion. And it's so multivalent. There's so many ways to get you, Ramona. It's unbelievable. I mean, even at the level I'm at in my profession, I still am in meetings where I say something. The conversation goes on. A man says what I just said 5 minutes later, and they go, oh, that's a great idea, Bob. Like, what the hell's that about, right? Or you get spoken over, you know. Justice Ginsburg always said, you know, the women justices in the Supreme Court were the ones who were spoken over most of the time, interrupted, all of that stuff. It's so deeply seated culturally, but that doesn't mean we don't do everything we can to chip away at it at every opportunity, and things will get better. Do you want to be a curmudgeon, Annalisa?
Not for my closing comments, although maybe I'll be a little bit of a curmudgeon and sort of, I've been reflecting a lot about the apprenticeship model in our practice recently, because I think it is where a lot of our challenges, it helps us. It allows us to grow and to learn from talented people who have a wealth of experience. But I think if we look at it historically, I mean, it's rooted in medieval models of guilds that were literally designed to exclude. And so as long as we have this hierarchical sort of linear apprenticeship model in the field, I think the power structures are going to be such that it's really difficult to change. And so, you know, some of what Nicole's talking about changing to these matrix learning models and creating multiple paths and creating a world where, you know, you can learn something at any point in your career, and you can learn from someone at any point in their career. I think it's really, really hard to change this.
Okay, so I'll start by saying that, you know, over the course of my 25 plus years of my career, there has certainly been some level of change. When I look back to when I started, from when I was in college to sort of my rise up the corporate ladder and, you know, corporate world, you know, in the beginnings, I was certainly alone. And then by the time that I left, things had definitely shifted. But I would say that the shift was too small. And, you know, just like the pandemic I talked about has had a seismic shift in the way that we look at work and how we practice work, I think there needs to be a seismic shift in the way that we approach equality. And, you know, in order to make real substantive change in the, you know, the course of my lifetime. And so I think that that's something that's, you know, easy said, that's how to do it. But I think things like this tonight, right, and talking, and, you know, every voice matters. And the more that we can kind of bring light to it, and especially women in leadership roles, is, you know, by kind of, and people who have actually, you know, power to make shift. But I think shift comes in both directions. I actually want to make sure I restate that, because I think it's actually really important it has to come in all directions. I think that's actually really critical, and it's not just from top down, but it's bottom up, it's from the sides, it's from everywhere. And so I think that needs to happen, and people really just need to raise their voices, come together, and just as it's kind of transformed workplace, people came together. I kind of want to go back one last thing to what the question was earlier, and we kind of said leave. I would say another way to kind of look at that is to gather everybody in your office together and unify yourselves. The strength is in numbers. And so that's kind of what I think needs to happen in order to really create sort of this significant critical shift that needs to happen. And it has to kind of happen all at once and together.
So maybe I'll just contribute by saying that I agree with everything that has been said. At the same time, I would just like to offer two thoughts. One is, I would be remiss if we lost sight that in the end, that many of us have signed up to be professionals and to be excellent at something that is really specific, which is acts of design or acts of construction relative to buildings. And I would say that there's a slight difference between wanting to identify excellence and the fact that what we do as a craft, and that we want to bring others through this craft by increasing levels of knowledge, which maybe is what I think about when I think about guild systems. I learned how to craft something at level A, and then over time I get better and better and better. And I think that for the excellence of our profession, I still think there's certain aspects of that I think are really great. We can't learn that in a book. We cannot learn it in an equation. We learn it through human to human interaction. And maybe at the best of levels, that's what I would hope that we can maintain through the changes that I still think are, of course, absolutely needed, because that's what we're doing tonight. We're kind of, in a way, working our way to knowledge by being with others. That's one aspect. And so if we change, I just want to I identify that our goal still is the excellence of the built environment, however we want to describe that. The other is that it's interesting, the observation, Shirley, about the letter and what recognition that why would you write a letter that in a way would kind of sort of, and I agree completely. I've often been asked to think about how would you position your work relative to others, and I would say, well, make sure that you're participating in a community that is recognizing of your work. At the same time, I was thinking, wouldn't it have been great if we were in a world where that letter could identify the fact that we are multivalent, have a great deal of values, and some of them may not necessarily be determined only on the work that we do in one sector, but the work that we do across all sectors of our lives. And hopefully we'll be at a point one day when our letters can in fact show the incredible work. That's one goal I hope that we can all reach.
Yeah, that would be a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful goal. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. That's really what a hopeful place to end. I do want to, we had one more audience question that maybe we can quickly answer. I know we are at 8:03, but if anybody wanted to take this on, it's from Shannon, and she asks, how should we be changing how we teach professional practice in architecture schools? Franca, you're nodding very knowingly.
No.
Being a beloved UPenn professor, do you have any kind of tips?
No, I appreciate that question from Shannon. And that's a really important question, because of course those courses are, at the knot between the academic world and the professional world. And I would say that, for instance, having wonderful case studies by practicing women, as we have on this panel tonight, would be one way for sure. But also, completely looking at the structure by which the practice is represented in those courses, so that we actually ask, who is the practice serving, as opposed to how is the practice serving us?
Fabulous. Thank you for that. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us tonight. Shirley, Nicole, Annalisa, Franca, Ramune, Stephanie, and Fotini, thank you for your help. We're so grateful to all of you that attended, and we're so happy to have space to have this conversation. So thank you very much, and please do join us for future events, and feel free to reach out to us at info@beattoronto.com if you have any questions or you have any follow-up that you'd like to do. This will be posted to our YouTube page. It has been recorded, so feel free to rewatch it. I know I will. So thank you very much. Have a great night.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Take
Bye.
care.
Thanks all.